Hello and welcome to our University of Michigan Africa Week conference. Thank you all so much for being here and connecting with one another, whether across the campus here in Ann Arbor or across hemispheres. I'd like to give a special shout out to all the students who are in attendance at the conference. I'm proud that we're here together this week to look forward and to shape a shared future. We know that the continent of Africa is poised for great change, with fast-growing populations and economies. We've also seen a great commitment to education, to research, and to creating and sustaining the types of academic programs that lead to mutual benefits and enormous opportunities for all. These opportunities are a tribute to faculty, students, and partners from both of our continents. At Michigan, we take great pride in being an international community of scholars made stronger by the contributions of students and colleagues from around the world. And we're honored to welcome students from nearly 20 African countries who study with us here in Ann Arbor. I'd like to express my utmost appreciation to our friends, fellow educators and researchers from Africa, and to the faculty, students, and staff of the University of Michigan. This includes the Provost Advisory Committee, whose members have helped us to reach this very exciting point, and Valeria Bertacco, our Vice Provost for Engaged Learning. But before I discuss our very promising future, I'd like to take us back a few years, actually about 137 years, to 1884, and the enrollment at U of M of John Mavuma Nembula. Our historians believe that he was the first student coming from Africa to join our campus. He went on to become one of the first Black physicians in Southern Africa. In addition to treating patients and working as a surgeon, Dr. Nembula also taught physiology and inspired future generations of African scientists and medical professionals. From that very early example of educational impact, we have grown, and we've done it together. Dr. Sinead Fisheha, now a Michigan adjunct professor of obstetrics and gynecology, was instrumental in establishing a partnership that is addressing maternal mortality in her native Ethiopia and in other parts of the African continent. As a member of our faculty, she met with the Ethiopian health minister and helped to launch our collaboration with St. Paul's Hospital Millennium Medical College in Addis Ababa. The effort initially resulted in a program to train OB/GYN physicians, but it soon expanded to include training for other disciplines, including gastroenterology, radiology, transplant surgery, ophthalmology, and many others. We'll be hearing from Dr. Faseha on Thursday as well. At last count, U of M has more than 160 projects in more than 40 African countries. I believe that research universities have an enormous potential to collaborate on meaningful change in the most dynamic areas of the world. And programs that focus on mutual benefits among partners are the key that can unlock that potential. Many of the individuals and groups I previously mentioned have helped to outline a set of priorities for our work ahead. Informed by our past and inspired by our future potential, we will engage with Africa in research and education to participate in and learn from the growth and innovations that will take place there. We must serve our students by providing experiences that include the African context and by supporting the development of a global cultural awareness that includes Africa. Our pledge is that our work will have 4 primary features. First, our collaborations will involve at least 2 equal partners, at least one of which is African. We are much stronger, as we've demonstrated for decades when we work together. Second, our collaborations will be dedicated to long-term engagements that support sustainable connections. Dr. Faseha has discussed the importance of long-term work since becoming Director of International Programs for the Susan T. Buffett Foundation. In her role, she sees too many other temporary programs designed to address individual diseases rather than to create long-term solutions that broadly increase the permanent capacity to do good. Emphasizing the difference at U of M, she added, and I quote, "So the moment the funding is pulled, everything collapses. I have news for you. Global health is not practiced anywhere else in the world the way it's practiced in Michigan." The third piece is that our engagement should have potential for high impact outcomes. I had the wonderful opportunity to meet living examples of this commitment during a reception at my house for the U of M Africa Presidential Scholars in 2019. The program brings early career faculty members from Africa to Ann Arbor to work with Michigan faculty mentors on research, an academic degree, publishing, or other scholarly activities. Since it was begun in 2008 by my predecessor, Mary Sue Coleman, it has served 162 faculty members from nearly 20 countries. A special hello to any University MAPS scholars with us today. Finally, we will prioritize engagements and activities that leverage the multidisciplinary strengths of the University of Michigan within a geographical region. Our experience tells us those are the most effective. Our disciplinary strength at U of M extends across the full breadth of human inquiry. I've mentioned medicine, but virtually all of our academic programs can and do engage, including the humanities, arts, social sciences, business, and engineering. I again appreciate all of you for participating in this week's conference. As part of a truly impressive agenda, I want to note that my presidential counterpart, Patrick Wua of Sheshi University in Ghana, will be featured tomorrow. And Wednesday, we'll hear from Leah Tandesa, the Ethiopian Minister of Health. Dr. Tadesse is the former executive director of our Center for International Reproductive Health Training. She's also the former CEO of St. Paul's Hospital Millennium Medical College, our outstanding partner in Addis Ababa that I had mentioned earlier. This conference is a tremendous example of how the seeds for our success have been planted by generations of scholars and committed supporters. Now it's up to us to grow and nurture our wonderful partnerships. We look forward to building on our shared success together with all of you. Thank you. It's now my pleasure to introduce our next session. Today's conference theme is economics and health, and we have 2 globally recognized leaders to guide the conversation. Today's Fireside Chat features Vera Songwe, United Nations Undersecretary General and Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Africa, and Susan Collins, U of M's Provost and Executive Vice President for Academic Affairs. Provost Collins is an international macroeconomist whose research and service has expanded understanding of the determinants of economic growth and fostered policies to improve living standards in countries at all levels of development. She joined the Michigan faculty in 2007, serving as the Joan and Sanford Weill Dean of the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy until 2017. Provost Collins has served as a member of the board of directors of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago since 2015, and is a board member of the National Bureau of Economic Research and the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. I would also add that her outstanding leadership during the COVID-19 pandemic has made it possible for U of M to continue looking forward and seeking out greater partnerships around the world. Dr. Sangwe has a long-standing track record of providing policy advice on development and a wealth of experience in delivering development results for Africa. Prior to joining the ECA, she was the regional director of the International Finance Corporation, covering West and Central Africa, and has held multiple leadership positions in the World Bank. Her service also includes the Brookings Institution's Africa Growth Initiative and the African Union's Institutional Reform Team. Dr. Sangwe earned her undergraduate degree in economics and political science from the University of Michigan, and she's remained a close friend of our campus, inspiring our students with her accomplishments and ongoing engagements. Welcome back, Dr. Sangwe. I'll now turn things over to Provost Collins.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, President Schlissel. I really appreciate the introduction, and I'm just delighted to be here. I'm going to make a few very brief introductory remarks and then welcome again Dr. Sangwe and start our first session. So we're really delighted to have so much interest across campus and around the world for Africa Week. And it's a week packed with discussions and ideas that we hope will inspire students, faculty, and staff to engage with and support partnerships with Africa for decades to come. I'm especially excited in speaking to the many students who are joining us from academic institutions, both in the US and in Africa and around the world, because you are the ones who will really be leading much of the future effort. So this morning, we're starting by setting the economic context in Africa and discussing the direction that African countries are taking, collaborating and leveraging with one another. Tomorrow, we will discuss the role that technology plays in supporting that direction. And on Wednesday, we'll discuss the critical contributions of higher education and cultural heritage in developing the new generation of globally engaged citizens across the continents. So as was just mentioned a few minutes ago, I am sitting down virtually with Dr. Vera Sangwe, and it's such a pleasure to be here. Giving her distinguished history and extensive experience in all aspects of economic development in Africa, I can't think of a better person to help us launch the University of Michigan's Africa Week. Dr. Sangwe, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. It's great to have you be here.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me start by thanking Mark, the president, and yourself, of course. Thank you so much. Thanks to everybody for inviting me, and always a pleasure. Wish we could have done it in person, but fantastic idea to have an Africa Week at the University of Michigan. I've been invited to Harvard and MIT and all, and finally, yes, we have one at Michigan, and this is really great. So absolutely, thank you very much for launching this.
So to get us started, I actually thought that I would ask you about the role of the UN in your position. I think that typically most people really don't have a good sense of what role the United Nations actually plays in helping with economic development, and in particular, your role as the UN's Under Secretary General and the Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission on Africa. So to get us started, would you tell us just a bit about what we should know about that?
So we do, the UN Economic Commission for Africa is 62 years old today. And we were formed, we have 5 similar economic commissions, one in Europe, one in Latin America, one in Asia, and one in the Middle East. And each of us was formed at the sort of cusp of independence. The oldest one of us is the one in Latin America, which was formed, I think, 2 years before ours. So they're 64 years old. And then formed 1 year later was the European Economic Commission for Europe. And then a year later, the Economic Commission for Africa. We were formed before any African countries got independence. And so initially the idea was to support sort of economic development, provide the kind of capacity building, provide the kind of economic analysis that was needed at the time, 1958, for countries to begin to establish themselves, understand what sort of economic dynamics were going on. And so that's sort of what each of us does in each of our different geographies. Now, the Economic Commission for Africa in particular, we are one of the rare UN agencies or even international development agencies that covers all of Africa. So from Algeria to Zimbabwe, I like to say, and Dakar to Djibouti. And essentially we look at, economic issues across the continent, from prices to competition. We just passed, as many of our leaders who follow Africa will know, the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, which happened January 1, was launched. This is an idea that was set by Kwame Nkrumah, 20 years ago with the founding fathers, and later picked up and sort of carried through. But, there's been a lot of, and I think that's the importance of an institution like ours, where, for the first 25 years of Africa's independence, it was a lot more political independence. And there needed to be, at some point, a transition from political independence to economic independence. And that's where then institutions like ours, of course, working with a plethora of UN agencies, focusing on climate change, focusing on data and statistics. Data is an important part of development. And just to be able to begin to help African countries, get the right population data, we're talking about the SDGs and, SDGs in 2030. We have a big unit that does only statistics, helps countries with their household surveys, with their censuses. We're now trying to help countries with how you use big data to gather more information. So there's all of that we needed to put in place. Of course, health, an important part. Initially at independence, we did a lot more health and education. Now, of course, we're moving into infrastructure and private sector development and digitization. So I think we have helped. Our main role is to help Africa steer these conversations and guide them. And as I like to say, we bring the world to Africa and take Africa to the rest of the world. So we are an advocate for Africa outside of Africa, but within Africa, we help. Our mantra is ideas for a prosperous Africa. So we come up with, what new things we can do to get Africa faster to development.
Thank you. So actually your kind of introduction here has spanned so many of the topics that I hope that we can spend a bit more time on in our conversation this morning. So I'd like to come back a little bit later to the new free trade area, which I think is really interesting and of course has just been launched. And I can't help but highlight your comment about the role of statistics and data, and I think many people underestimate how important actually having data about trends in all different sectors of the economy in the country, how important that is to formulating policy, to identifying the challenges, seeing what's working well. So that really is a really important, but often perhaps under-recognized function. So I certainly also want to come back to some of the politics versus economics and those interactions as we're talking. But maybe the next thing just to establish as a base is, what is the current economic situation in Africa? My understanding is that the World Bank forecasts an output decline of more than 3% for 2020, and that's actually the first recession in 25 years. Say a bit more about what the current economic context is.
Difficult, very difficult and tough. Of course, we're going through what we call almost a sort of triple whammy. We have, of course, the COVID pandemic, which is the health crisis. Then we had, as a result of that, actually a much more difficult beating up, which was the economic crisis, which has led to a first recession in 25 years. And then finally, climate change, because we can abstract from the climate challenges that the continent is facing. Some countries are losing 9 to 11% of their GDP because of climate change. Ethiopia, for example, we have locusts, we have drought, and then we have heavy rainfall. So, all of that constellation of events coming together at a time when Africa was growing at only 3.2% on average. Our larger countries, South Africa, Angola, and Nigeria not doing so well, initial conditions 2019, you get a COVID crisis in 2020, and we're ill prepared for it. So what that has done is we're growing at 3.2%. We've gotten a hit of almost 5.4% of our GDP taken out. So we're down to negative 2.1% of growth in 2020, hoping maybe that we begin, I think we all thought as we were closing 2020 that 2021 will be slightly better. I think interestingly what we have seen is, and one of the arguments that we're making at the ECA now is to sort of relook at the classification of countries, because what we have seen is a new classification of vulnerable countries, which are countries that were much more open to international trade, much more open to remittances, much more open to tourism. Those are the countries that are suffering the most from the COVID pandemic, in addition to the health crisis, of course. Whereas countries that are basically agricultural economies are doing more or less okay. And I will be able to come out of this crisis. Uganda, Tanzania are almost coming back out of the crisis, growing back up at 5-6%. Egypt, which is a huge tourism economy, when you have flights that shut down, when you have Europe. And that is the other part of this crisis, right? It's an externality on the African economy. It's if Europe closes down, if the Middle East closes down, if the United States closes down, we don't get the Christmas visitors, we don't get the remittances. And so essentially that's been a huge, huge impact. Of course, the other big impact of COVID has been education. Almost 300 kids out of school because of lack of internet connectivity. So a huge divide that is being created. And then finally, poverty. We have essentially an economy that is mostly informal. The informal sector is not in any way sort of in data systems. And so when you have a crisis like that, and an example I normally give is one of Egypt, where Egypt has 3% poverty levels, but 40% vulnerable. So essentially when you have a huge shock, as like the one we've had with both the health and the economic, the health pandemic and the economic recession, you have 43% of your population immediately below the poverty line. How do you then come to aid of those kinds of populations? Hence the discussion for financial assistance and how we can do more with the international financial institutions.
So, so many dimensions there. Just a couple of the things that you said that maybe I would highlight and say a bit more about. One is that I think it's often not recognized just how different this recession, this economic downturn is for countries compared to the ones that I don't want to say we're used to, but the things that came from financial crises or shocks had such a different set of implications. And as you highlighted, the countries that were more open were the ones that we've tended to think are more protected in some ways and are less likely to see downturns. And the fact that they have been the most susceptible really is forcing, I would think, us to rethink how to help move them forward. So two things. You mentioned the importance of education, and of course, coming from a university, that's one of the focuses and things that we think a lot about. In Africa, that interplays with the demographic trends and changes in particularly important ways. And I wonder if you'd say a bit more about how how you see that interaction. I mean, Africa's, I think, the only region that's expected to grow over the next century, and its population, of course, is very young. And so the role of education in terms of those longer term trends is so important for Africa.
I think three things, and no, thank you for that question. I think three things that are coming out is the first is with the crisis, a re-questioning of, what kind of education and education for what? And just to lay bare some of the issues that we're now thinking about and working with the African Center for Disease Control to do is, where are the African scientists? Are they, now we talk about the South Africa variant. Are the African scientists looking at that? And so very quickly, we've been able to bring together African scientists, not just from the continent, but African scientists, there's many African scientists in like Dr. Fiseha and all the rest that are in external universities, back together to say we need to continue to strengthen scientific research on the continent. So I think what that has done has sort of reinvigorated maybe a segment of our educational system that was crying out for attention that did not get it. And so now there is a lot more conversation around, can Africa begin to work on South Africa and Senegal have factories that produce vaccines, but we don't do the research. And we have the Institut Pasteur and a couple of others that are quite good, but not good enough to do the vaccines. And so there's a lot of questioning around those conversations. So I think that's one good thing that has happened is we've talked about STEM a lot, but there hasn't been enough attention to sort of the medical health sciences and that research. Now, coming back to, 20% of 40% of our population is below the age of 20. And so again, a new conversation around what kind of education. What COVID crisis has done, it has shown us that the kids who have access to the internet, the kids who know how to use computers, are those who are going to stay in school and who can do better. And those who don't have access are the ones who are going to get left out. And so again, should we redefine our system? So the United Nations, for example, has launched a program where we want to put, make every school on the continent connected, internet connected. This was not a priority, a year and a half ago. A year and a half ago, we just needed every girl in school. Now we need every girl in school and every girl with a laptop. So I think that has pushed the sort of, ambition on education a little bit further. And I think this is important because once you do that, you also begin to allow for children's minds to grow broader than just the core school curriculum, because then they can access all the other information that is out there on the internet. And I think that's a very important thing. But finally, it's the whole sort of teaching profession and what you do with the teaching profession. I think that on the continent, because of, a couple of reforms and policy processes that had not necessarily been put in place in the right way, we lost a lot of our good teachers. And so I think rebuilding that core sets and skill sets of sort of educators is going to be quite an important component of the system going forward.
So again, many themes we could talk more about. I want to come back a little bit later to the issues you raise about connectivity, the digitization, and some of the roles that can and certainly will play. And so perhaps that's something we could come back to. I wonder if, before we shift gears, if you would say a bit about what you think economic recovery looks like. I mean, certainly for Africa specifically, I mean, certainly the likely timing of vaccine access is, much slower than we're anticipating here in the US. There's a lot of impatience here, but the challenges are much broader there. That's part of it, and it relates to many of the other topics you've said. So what does recovery look like? And, what would an optimistic scenario be in terms of how that might play out?
I think recovery for Africa is like recovery for everybody else. We need those vaccines. We need to get to herd immunity, 60–70% of the population vaccinated. There is no recovery if we don't get the vaccines. I think the danger is precisely that we get all these different variants and then, we keep vaccinating and revaccinating because a new variant has come. So that's really the most important, because then, of course, it stops the lockdowns. Every month of lockdown costs about $29 billion on the continent. We cannot afford that. So that will be the first part of the recovery. I think the second part of the recovery will be allowing our private sector to access the kind of liquidity that it needs to start reinvesting and getting people back to work, getting SMEs the resources they need for working capital, ensuring that, they can go back to providing the supplies that were needed, that businesses begin to open up, but really, targeting those small and medium enterprises, probably building off of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement that has now, provided the basis for larger markets across the continent. I think that would be the second part of the recovery: is liquidity, access to financing, and ensuring that our private sector, and particularly the SMEs, get some help. And finally, on the public sector side, that those who have fallen into poverty and cannot get back out get the assistance they need, maybe for training programs or maybe for sort of reinsertion as we begin to look sort of forward. And there will be, we hope, with the CFTA, which I call sort of the investment blueprint for Africa, hopefully new and alternative job employment opportunities, especially that we have a young population. So that reskilling and retooling. So I think there's going to be a lot of room, not just for, I think, handout safety nets, but maybe for sort of government programs to retool and reinsert people into new lines of business, especially if we look at the recovery as a sort of green recovery. So we want people to shift, jobs and functions to something that is more sustainable.
Yeah, so thank you for outlining the three-pronged approach. That makes a lot of sense. And, again, many twists and turns along the way. But before we shift gears and talk more about the free trade agreement, which you also mentioned as part of that way forward, I did just want to mention that there will be a panel on Thursday, the 18th of February, moderated by Tachi Yamada, that'll talk about COVAX, which is a global collaboration intended to provide equitable access to vaccines around the world. And so as part of Africa Week, that is one of the topics that we wanted to spend a bit of time on. So just wanted to share that out for our viewers. Shall we shift gears then and talk a bit about the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement? It actually came into force just on January, so less than 2 months ago. And it's actually the largest free trade agreement in the world, right? So it has a market of over 1 billion people, even though not all of the countries, I understand, have ratified it yet. So I wonder if you would just say a bit to start us off about what do you see as the main benefits of a free trade agreement for Africa?
I think there are 3 benefits to that. The first one, as you said, is it brings the whole continent together. So over 50 countries, over 1 billion people, 1.3 billion to be precise. And it allows then for, I think one of the things that we haven't done very well as a continent is essentially create regional supply chains. And the reason we haven't done that is because we have not been able to have access to our neighbors' markets or, free movement of goods and people. And so I think that creating such a large market allows you then to be able to think beyond, your border with 7 million people to a continent of 1.3 billion. The second thing that it does is essentially, and this is now to the economics of it, is it takes away all the tariffs. The tariffs on the continent are about 6.3%. And so what the CFTA is going, the Continental Free Trade Area agreement is going to do is it's going to take that away. So, beginning January 1 for all the countries that have ratified, that went to 0. So essentially that reduces the cost of goods. It encourages more business, but more importantly, on the sort of economics of the CFTA, we had, I think, our non-tariff barriers, but this is true for, everybody in the world. Non-tariff barriers tend to be a lot more non-transparent, and so most of the time higher. So I said tariff 6.3%. If you try to quantify the average non-tariff barriers on the continent, are about 16.3%. We're talking about, paperwork that you need to go from one country to the other with imports, the time it takes to get your goods out of the ports, phytosanitary conditions and different requirements in different places for different things. Those kinds of things are all going to be harmonized. So if you were a pharmaceutical producer in Kenya or in Egypt or in South Africa now, we could harmonize, generic aspirins, and you could sell them across the continent very easily. So, the paperwork, and that's the first point we're all asking ourselves. In 1 year, I'll be talking with you and you'll tell me, how has the first year been? And one of the indicators we would like to use to see whether we've done well in the first year is one-stop border control shops. Today you have 6, 7, 8. I'm sure everybody has anecdotes about border control shops on the continent. We would like to bring that to 1. It's a very, very ambitious fit, but I think we're benefiting from the CFTA was not, as I said before, it didn't start 5 years ago. It started 25 years ago. And what we have are regional economic communities where some of these things are already happening. We have the COMESA, which takes care of East Africa and Southern African Development Committee. We have ECOWAS, the West African Economic Community. We have the Central African Economic Community, and all of them already had free movement of goods within those communities. So the most difficult now will be to break the external borders to each of those regional economic communities. And there is, I think, the difficulty that we have to do. Now, the other thing that we would like to do is integrate global value chains. but having used regional supply chains. And so one of the topical issues in the United States today is about battery storage and the need for, moving to clean energy and using batteries. Now in South Africa, Burundi, and DRC, the combination of those three countries can get together, maybe with some scientists from the University of Michigan, to begin to produce batteries for Tesla and GM and all those who have announced that they want to go to clean cars. But this was not possible before because, South Africa is in SADC, Burundi is in East Africa, DRC is in Central Africa, and they all have different things. I think by bringing, and each one of them then exported its raw material to China or the United States or someplace else, where that raw material was transformed into battery storage. We could do that on the continent, add more value, create more jobs, and I think build the kind of technology centers that we're looking for.
So that's a great example. And clearly there's a lot of opportunity here. I mean, my understanding is that at the moment, of the total trade of African countries, only about 18% of it is within the continent. And that compares with, for Asia and for Europe, each, their kind of within region trade is more like 60%. So clearly there's a lot of opportunity to build on there. But I wonder if you'd say a bit, I mean, you talked about the fact that this has been underway for not just 5 years, but for quite a long time. And as I'd mentioned at the beginning, not all of the countries have ratified it. What do you see as the biggest challenges? And is that something that the UN is involved in trying to work through? Say a bit more about that.
No, thank you. Thank you for coming back. At the Economic Commission for Africa, we have actually the Africa Trade Policy Center. And so a lot of the work that's done by the African Union on the sort of trade conversations is actually supported by us. A lot of the technical pieces, a lot of the negotiations, the protocol documents, we do jointly with the African Union. Of course, this is a member states protocol. And so a lot of the work is done under the leadership of the African Union. I think what we do here, and now we're moving into sort of the second stage, and this is interesting because this will be interesting maybe for some of the people listening at the University of Michigan. We're moving to the second stage of the protocols, where we're going to be looking at intellectual property rights, what kinds of intellectual property rights regimes we need to put in place. So at the Economic Commission for Africa, we're doing a lot of that work to see, what is the right property right regime that we want to, intellectual property rights regime we want to put in place. If you look at the Department of Justice in the United States, there's been an amended sort of IPO indication. And I think we're going to be building on that. I'm very happy to work with anybody who is working on this. More importantly, competition policy. We haven't really had an African competition policy. The EU has a white paper on competition policy. Of course, the United States has one, commerce clause. This is just transferring and crossing borders. I think, U of M is sort of known for this pieces of work. Very happy to collaborate with you on that. But at the Economic Commission for Africa, this is some of the pieces of work going forward that we're trying to put in place to ensure that, we have that in place. Industrial policy, we don't yet have clarity on sort of what is the industrial policy, what is the regime that we want to take forward as a continent. So this again is something that we will be looking at, industrial investment policy going forward. But interestingly enough, e-commerce was something that we thought we would look at in 2022. We will just look this year at intellectual property rights, competition policy, and investment policy under the trades and goods and services. But because of everything that's happened with COVID, we've now accelerated, and the leaders have accepted, the ECA and the African Union trade commissioners went to the heads of states and said, we must begin to think about e-commerce and put some legislation and regulation around that so we can harmonize it. And so we got the Economic Commission for Africa wrote, working with the African Union and others, the World Bank and other development partners, but in the lead, the ECA and the African Union, the digital strategy for Africa. Of course, with issues around security of information, security of data, digital ID, trade, and how do you regulate trade, how do you tax trade? So there's a whole slew of issues there that we have to open up in 2021, 2022 that we'll have to sort of come to terms with as we go forward. So these are the different things that, again, as I said, we at the Economic Commission for Africa host the Africa Trade Policy Center. And so a lot of this work is being done with us. We now have an implementation center, which was created by the heads of states in the African Union, which is the AFCFTA Secretariat, which is resident in Ghana. And so we're working with that, the implementation arm, and then the policy arms are sort of sitting in Addis with the African Union and of course, the Economic Commission for Africa, but supported by the African Development Bank, the World Bank, and others.
Yeah, so kind of an all hands on deck initiative and lots to watch going forward. I do want to come back and spend a bit of time talking about the e-commerce and the digitization, but first I actually have one other question related to some of the challenges for the free trade agreement. And that comes back to some comments that you made at the beginning related to the interactions between the politics and the economics. You know, often with free trade agreements, there are regional disparities. So as you know, as you were describing some of the value chain opportunities, those are likely to cause real gains for some countries, but perhaps losses in other countries, and managing that can be really challenging. And I wonder if you'd say a bit about the thinking of how that might be handled with the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. It's been such a challenge in some other free trade agreements.
So there are two challenges that we've been facing, and that's a very good question, Susan. I think one of them is the rules of origin. And of course, the rules of origin is essentially, you know, by what is the percentage of local content of a good that you need to have for it to qualify as a good that, you know, benefits under the free trade area agreement. We have a lot of, you know, semi-finished goods that come from outside the continent, from Europe, Southeast Asia, and the United States. And so, you know, if you were Nigeria, and let me just take the case in point of Nigeria, which is a real case, and Nigeria says, oh, but we have this sort of, you know, tons of semi-finished goods that come to my neighbors, and then they're going to use the benefit of the free trade area agreement to come into Nigeria. So we've done a lot of work in terms of working on the rules of origin. What is the percentage of sort of local content or continental content that you need to get that done? That still is a political conversation, and it's continued. I think we're getting close to, and that's why some countries haven't signed yet. We're getting close to I think really getting a full final conversation around that. Now the second you know, I think more difficult conversation is around how quickly we get to, you know, really full open markets. And, you know, when the whole sort of, we have a continent where many economies depend on 4 or 5 commodities for their competitiveness. And so there's a question of, if you open it, you lose on one hand, even though we've done some work that shows that only 2 or 3 countries will actually lose on the revenue side, you know, tariff revenues because of the CFTA. But what you may do, and there are some economies that are not yet fully competitive, have been very protective, you know, and so there's a lot of behind the border issues that still need to be regulated. Energy costs are too high. And so your neighbor can flood your markets, and it creates unemployment. That's where the politics comes in. And so that conversation, I think we also need to do quite carefully and deliberately to ensure that, you know, there's not so much dislocation. And that's why the free trade area agreement is coming with a lot of work around sort of boosting inter-Africa trade, which is sort of helping countries with behind the border issues of improving skills, you know, improving competitiveness, retooling and reskilling economy. So when they open up, they don't get sort of competed out of the markets by others.
Great, thank you. So we actually only have a little bit more than 5 minutes left. As I suspected, time has gone really quickly. I did want to spend at least a bit of our remaining time talking more about the opportunities that digitization and information communication technology offers for Africa. And I know that's something that you've thought deeply about. And I wonder if you would share some of your perspectives in terms of the opportunities here.
The Economic Commission for Africa, we have something we launched 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, the Digital Center for Excellence. And amazing opportunity, I think, and that's where, you know, the link with 51% of Africa's GDP today is in the service sector. COVID has shown us that, you know, a lot of development is going to have to be in that sector. When we do the CFTA, we're going to need a lot more logistics and a lot more services support. So I think all of these examples just show the importance of digitization on the continent, but it must start from data. it must start from identification. And so a lot of the work that we are focusing on at the ECA now is trying to see whether we can do digital ID. Almost 500 million Africans don't have an ID. Very difficult to do business, even more cross-border business if you don't have an ID. So we're working on that. At the end of next month, we will actually be launching, again, something maybe that hopefully we can collaborate with UFM on, an artificial intelligence center in Congo, in a university, just again to begin to see whether we can develop that skill, which is a unique skill, but we have a lot of it in Kenya, in Cameroon. We want to sort of put a few hubs on the continent. The number of sort of, tech startups from the continent, even with the crisis, has gone up from about 316 in 2016 to today almost 700. So there is a huge space there for the youth to be innovative and to be productive. And so we hope that if we can create the policy environment, create the kind of competitive environment that these young kids need, and then of course the financing, venture capital, early stage financing for that, we hope to see a new sort of change in the growth trajectory for the continent.
So I also wanted just to highlight again the comments that you made earlier in our conversation about how COVID has really shone a spotlight of the importance of this work for education and for the future generations, right? And so that's intertwined here as well. And so certainly really important. There's a lot more we could talk about. I just wanted to mention that there is a panel tomorrow on the 16th on the role of computing in Africa's economic future that Valeria Bertacco will be moderating. And so that's a topic we wanted to make sure as part of Africa Week that we, did spend some focused time on because it is really so important. We've also spent quite a bit of time throughout, I think, talking about the role that universities can play, both African universities around the world, including the University of Michigan. Before we shift gears, because I do have one last question for you, I wonder if you have any additional thoughts or comments about the types of engagements that you think would have the most potential impact for the kind of academic institutions in terms of economic development and growth in Africa.
I think President Sisha, when he started his sort of introduction, talked about this sort of long-term engagement and partnerships. And I think there's a couple of areas where we can have that long-term engagement. One of them is sort of developing ecosystems of sort of research and business. And I think at the U of M, we have something like that, and seeing whether we can work together to create a couple of those satellites of the continent will be, I think, something which will be quite useful and quite important. I think there is a lot of work, and you mentioned it a little bit in your question about politics and economics, and that marriage, of sort of what kinds of social policy. U of M is doing a lot of work now on sort of fiscal federalism and sort of even just federalism per se, local governments and central governments, and we see sort of the importance of that for institutions globally and the strength of institutions. One thing Africa is still sort of in the building process of, you guys are 200 and getting to 300 years in your institutions building, we're only at 68. And I think there's a lot of work we can do there on public policy institutions building, whether it's from federalism to competition policy. I think there are things there that we can sort of launch research projects around. Finally, I just wanted to say something that we're doing on the ICT side. In December, we had what we call a coding camp for 2,000 young girls across the continent. We did it virtually. It is actually possible. Amazing ideas they came up with. Now, how to nurture that. Again, I think that, the business center, the U of M, we could maybe look at that and see. And then maybe join curriculars. You talked about heritage. You talked about, I think, the importance of history for development. There are some of those more sort of literary arts, but very important fundamentals that we could work on. And we're just launching a heritage management program at the ECA. Would be very happy. 10% of the GDP of economies that do well on their heritage, creates jobs. And so I think we can do it differently, and maybe working again with the university, we can see how we do that in a way. Africa has an amazing and rich history and culture, and as you know, so I think there is ways that we can also build up on that. So a lot of different areas where, of course, medical sciences, given that we're talking about COVID.
Absolutely. Thank you for mentioning such a range of really, really interesting and important opportunities. So our time is almost over. I did want to invite you, since I know we have a number of students watching, just to ask whether, as you think back on your own experiences, what advice you would have for them, maybe as a good place for us to wrap up our conversation.
So I would say today, to push boundaries, as I was saying to the president, in my days at the University of Michigan, we were not having, for sure, Africa Week, let alone Black America Week. And I think that, I used to write for the Michigan Daily. I was probably one of the only Black, whatever, African American, whatever, that was writing for it. And so go Michigan Daily, and I know that we're celebrating an anniversary. I think it's important to just work really hard. To be curious. Curiosity is an important part of it. Hard work, and then partnerships, and this is what we're doing here today, is build those partnerships, keep them, because they are, I think, quite important. And the world, I think, as COVID has shown, and this is my closing remark, is that we are all connected. We're all one global public good, and if one of us does well, all of us do well together. And essentially, I think that's really, I think, as academic institutions, working for sort of, the better good, the better society, the more just and more equal society. What COVID will do, if we don't do it together, is really create this even more double path. In the United States, we already see it, right? The data is already showing, huge differences in incomes and consequences. It's happening, the same thing is happening on the continent. We cannot afford that because of the social disruptions. So my sense is those partnerships, working for a better and just system, I think, hard work, never give up, be curious.
Thank you. That's wonderful. The importance of partnership, and I really, really welcome and appreciate characterizing that as a global public good. I think that's a wonderful way to think about that. So thank you so much for both your time, but sharing your insights with us. Really appreciate that. And we look forward to working together in many, many ways in the future. So thank you. It's really been a pleasure to have a conversation with you this morning here and I think this evening there.
Thank you. I invite everybody to come to, we have internships. My pitch, come to the ECA, come to Addis. We have 7 other centers across Africa, so we don't have to send you to Addis, but we'll be very happy to build those partnerships and have some internships. Thank you again, and thanks to everybody that was listening for this really, really interesting conversation. Thank you, Susan.
It's been a pleasure. So thanks again to all of you for joining us. I just have a couple of wrap-up remarks. I wanted to again thank our audience and especially our students for spending some time. I hope that your contributions and your vision will continue to move us forward and really strengthen the partnerships that we've been talking about. The next panel will feature a discussion about the fintech industry, actually, which I think certainly will likely connect with some of the topics that we spent some time on already, and the impressive growth in that industry in many African countries. The moderator, Professor Adrienne Harris, is from the University of Michigan's Ford School of Public Policy, and she'll be joined with thought leaders from industry, government, and higher education, discussing success stories, opportunities, challenges, and we certainly hope that you will join us for that session as well. So please stay connected with the Africa Week. Feel free to stretch your legs for a bit. We'll meet back here at 9:30 Eastern Standard Time or 4:30 p.m. Central African Time. And again, hope to see you. Thank you so much for joining us. Take good care.